Hey, folks. Good evening. It's 10 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. Central. And I see those of you stacked up here in the chat room. I appreciate your presence here. And thanks for being interested enough to listen again to my reading of The Rise and Fall of the Nephilim. And I will preface this one more time by saying that some of the views in this book are views that I have modified since the writing of this book. So I'm working on getting toward a revision, a second edition, a follow-up to this book with my publisher, Red Wheel Weiser. And so that's in the future. I've got a couple of other projects I'm working on a fictional book for my agent right now. In case you're interested, it's called The 10 Breaths of Ra, and it's set in 1920 Egypt. And it involves a couple of characters that one is a British Romani whose family a generation before had been gypsies in the caravan, and his father made it rich. They own a big estate in England now. His name is Daniel Badcock, and he's a young 20-something adventurer, explorer. And his good friend, Dr. Eileen Byrne, I have her as fictionally as the first woman. She's Irish. She graduated from Oxford University with her PhD in archaeology. And these two team up for quite an adventure. It's historical, it's mystical, it's Egyptological, it's supernatural. There's all kinds of fun and adventure that take place. So I'm working on that book right now, trying to get that one done for my agent. That's a fictional book, and that'll be coming out, I don't know when. Probably, if I get it done soon enough, later this year or early next year. So keep your eyes peeled. So that's what I'm working on now, and I've got a couple of other things going on. And I'm going to expand my window just a little bit here so I can make sure I can see the chat room. And as you know, I'm going to do a reading on this book in chapter 3 tonight, and we'll do some commentary. And so if you have questions along the way, state them. If I see them, I'll address them. If I don't see them, I'll scroll back through at the end, and hopefully we'll catch them all. So let me say hi to people there. Kitten, nice to see you. Casper, good to see you. I think I saw Rocky in the room. So everybody, and by the way, I've been drinking some carbonated beverage, so hopefully I won't belch through the reading tonight. So She Said It is here. Nice to see you. Chris Jones. Let's see if anybody else is here that I want to call out and say hi. Said hi to Rocky already. Let's see, going back. That's who's in the room right now. And this preamble is really to give people time to get here. And when I say I like to start at 10 o'clock on the nuts, that's what I meant. So if you come to listen to these broadcasts, try to get in here as close to the top of the hour as possible. If you can't make it, you can always see it in the rerun, as it were. So Judy, nice to see you. Thank you, Judy, for that. And I think everybody else that's sitting there right now, I've already said hello to. So why don't we get back into it here? And this is my book, The Rise and Fall of the Nephilim, and published by New Page Books in 2011. It's probably been the best-selling of my books. And as I mentioned, probably a few things I don't see the same way since I wrote this. So far, we've covered Science Almighty. We've talked about Who's Your Daddy, from Elohim to Nephilim. And tonight, we're going to hit a topic. You may have heard me talk about this before. I know on Rocky's show I've talked about it. On Jeff's show I have. And I wrote this chapter in this book for a reason. It's called The Pharaoh-God of Israel. And I'm referring, of course, directly to Moses. And Moses would have been the man who penned the original Genesis passage that contains this excerpt about the Nephilim. And I really wanted to, in this book, establish that he was the author of the book, that there's not a historical reason to believe that he wasn't, and also to hopefully hit on the reasons why he would have penned this section, or at least included it in his writings. And so at first my publisher thought the chapter was superfluous. He said, I really want you to lose the chapter on Moses. And I gave him my justifications for having it in the book. And he said, okay, let's do it. So it's in here. And this is really the basis of the book I wrote with John Ward a couple of years later, The Exodus Reality, and my views on who Moses was in the historical record. So here we go. I'm going to start reading. Chapter 3, the Pharaoh-God of Israel. Who was Moses really? Yahweh spoke to Moses face to face as a man speaks to his friend. That's Exodus 33:11. And I've got some things to say on that, by the way, that face-to-face issue. I can't remember if it was in the chapter, so if it's not, we'll hit it as commentary. And then in Numbers 13:27 through 28 and verse 33, it says, they gave Moses this account. We went into the land which you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey. Here is its fruits. But the people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. We even saw descendants of Anak there. We saw the Nephilim there, the descendants of Anak of the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes. We looked the same to them. All right. Now let's get into the meat of the chapter. As I state in my public lectures on the topic of the Nephilim, we are now going to rabbit trail a bit. But it's vitally contextual, highly relevant sidetrack to understanding the bigger picture of the Watchers and the Nephilim. It's going to include a lot of history, but remember, history is fun. It's passionate. It's exciting. This isn't the stuff of sitting in a boring high school classroom. This is the stuff that opens the door and sheds the light. Understanding the past gives illumination to the present. We all have personal histories and things that have happened in our pasts that make us who and what we are today. The same applies to this outstanding character in history. Understanding that he is much more than a Bible story, but rather a real person who lived and breathed and experienced life, will help us to greater understand the things he wrote about and why he said what he said. Now, I got to do a little side note here. If you ever saw years ago, what was his name? Michael, I can't remember his last name, but he did a PBS series on finding the city of Troy and the Trojan Wars. And I remember one scene, seeing him standing there in front of a strata of rock. He's down on a beach in front of where the city of Troy was located. And in the rock behind him are stratas of rock and ash and rock. And he stood in front of that wall and he said, now look at this. He says, here you have a strata of rock, and here you have a strata of this, and a strata, then a strata of ash. And before that, a strata of rubble, and then another strata of ash. And he was so impassioned about talking about stratas of rock and ash because that little bit of geographical history shed a huge amount of light on the dating and the existence of the city of Troy. So this is why I think history is exciting. History can be taught boringly, and then you end up living the rest of your life thinking history is boring, or history can be taught to be fun and exciting, and there's passion behind it. That's the way I like to teach history. So let's move on. Of great importance to understanding the Genesis account of the Nephilim is having an understanding of the author of the book and the education he would have experienced in the royal courts of 18th dynasty Egypt. The first 5 books of the Bible's Old Testament, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, are collectively known as the Pentateuch, the books of the law, and their authorship is attributed to Moses, the most well-known lawgiver, Hebrew leader of the Judeo-Christian tradition. First of all, Moses is the author of the book of Genesis. Just because he's a biblical character whose story is made up of fantastical deeds and miraculous events does not mean he's simply part of a myth. It would be like saying George Washington is a myth because there were several crazy stories made up about him. I chopped down the cherry tree, I cannot tell a lie. Well, that never happened, but it's the mythology behind him. Doesn't mean Washington didn't exist. First of all, let's see, it is Moses, who the book of Exodus tells us, was born a Hebrew slave or an Israelite slave, living under captivity in the slave city of Goshen, in the delta region of the land of Egypt. The Hebrews had been living in Egypt as a family since the time of their ancestor patriarch Joseph, one of the sons of Jacob, Israel, who migrated them to Egypt during a time of great famine in Canaan, present-day Israel. The family grew into an expatriated people, numbering nearly, according to the biblical reference, 2 million by the time of the Exodus. And they suffered a gradual captivity imposed on them by the Egyptian pharaohs during a period of 4 centuries. Now, this is all according to the biblical story. It is important to point out, though, that although the story of Moses is rife with faith story tradition, many of the deeds of the historical man Moses cannot be found anywhere in recorded history, other than the pages of Holy Scripture and religious writings. And one has to dig very deeply to find the scant mentions that do exist. And even then, there is the monumental task of discerning the man from the legend. The historical treatment of his life, as it appears in the Old Testament books of Exodus through Deuteronomy, are events written from the perspective of the man himself. In a sense, they were autobiographical, comprising major context within 4 of the 5 books of the law in the Old Testament. Moses was a powerful man, striving, as would any leader of a new nation that was the product of invasion, rebellion, or coup, to establish his authority and base of power. It's important to understand that Moses was the product of 18th dynasty Egypt, where he was part of a ruling dynasty that held absolute power over its subjects. And this is where he learned the royal skills necessary for national leadership. This is where Moses learned that he was a son of the Pharaoh-God. This is where he learned to impose the will of a God-man over the people whom he ruled. In reading the pages of religious scripture, one must ask whether Moses was a mere figment of the pious imagination of Jewish rabbis and Hebrew historians, a mere adjunct to religious sentimentality and Judeo-Christian mythos, or was he a real personality of some stature and substance in Egypt, as the Jewish scriptures claim? During the biblical account of the 10 plagues of Egypt and the let my people go biblical account of let my people go audiences Moses had with arguably the most powerful monarch in the known world, we are given the distinct impression that Moses has absolute dominance over Pharaoh, the government, and the people. In fact, the biblical record states implicitly in Exodus 11:3, the man Moses was very great in the land of Egypt, in the sight of Pharaoh's servants, and in the sight of the people. During the period of the 10 plagues, the very word of Moses became as law in the courts of the Pharaoh and the land of Egypt. Take note of what most commentators on the biblical account have overlooked. Exodus 11:8. And all these your servants, Moses is addressing the Pharaoh, shall come down to me and bow themselves to me, saying, get out and all the people that follow you, and after that I will go out. And he went out from Pharaoh in the heat of a great anger. This is the way he addressed Pharaoh. He wasn't meek and mild. I remember his excuses in the Bible. I can't go back to Pharaoh. I can't talk. I'm meek. I can't say things right. I'm not an orator. Yet he was the most powerful man this Pharaoh had encountered, according to the biblical passage. Moses minced no words, but rather dictated with power and authority to the most powerful ruler of the ancient world. Moses was notable, exceptional, talented, and no ordinary man by any standard, past or present. Now, I have a lot more to say about Moses. I haven't reviewed this chapter in several years, so we'll read and see if I mentioned some of the things or for the things I've picked up through my research later. Next section of this chapter is faith story versus historical account. This is also where I am sure to draw a bit of heated criticism from my old Bible school classmates and fellow seminarians, as well as leaders and friends from the evangelical Christian circles in which I spent many years of my life. For to question the absolute authority of the Bible in its application to faith, practice, theology, or history is to question the very nature and attributes of God himself. Yet there are gaping holes in the scriptural historical accounts that can be filled only with extrapolation of historical data and the squeezing of size 13 feet into size 10.5 wide Egyptian sandals. We are informed by Polybius, who lived from 201 to 120 BCE, that there are essentially three classes of historians. One class slants their documentation for financial gain, expressing the pleasure or the plans of the kings and the states. Another class writes for those who enjoy rhetorical display, an enjoyment of the sensuous exploitation of words in a manner that sounds pleasant to the listener. Finally, some record the truth for the good of mankind. Now that's according to Polybius, who lived 2,200 years ago. Now, the New Testament references to Moses are written within a framework of early Christian apologetics. Now, do you know what apologetics are? Some of you probably do. Some of you maybe don't. Apologetics is the act or the art or the skill of writing something about somebody or something in order to make it look better or more real or more substantial than it actually was. It's apologetics, they call it. The faith story told by the early Christian apologists. Well, here, let's see, hold on. The New Testament references to Moses are written within a framework of early Christian apologetics, meant to establish the young Christian religion during its infancy. The faith story told by early Christian apologists is solid tradition that sets a foundation for religious practice and tradition. And the history remains obscure, unsubstantiated, and many times unverifiable by extant historical records of the day. There are many traditional tales of Moses, as well as traditional histories in the Jewish Mishnah and other writings, but the Egyptian historical records are silent. And even Moses himself, for some reason, refrains from mentioning historical names of the pharaohs and royalties that would have surrounded him during the first 40 years of his life, spent as a prince of Egypt. Wouldn't it be so much easier to date Moses if he had written in his works the names of the pharaohs that he served under? And that is because the writings of Moses were never meant to be cold, hard historical records. They were meant to establish the authority of God over Israel, as embodied in the authority of Moses. We see represented in the scripture an acceptable arrogance in Moses that is an indicative and many times necessary ingredient on the part of national leaders in establishing their authority. Even more so when that leader claims that his authority is one that is favored by the gods, or in Moses' case, by God himself. Moses, in writing of his relationship with God, states in Exodus 33:11 that he was able to speak to God face to face, as a man talks to his friend. Yet Moses was not destroyed by the utter holiness of God in a consuming fireball for his intimate contact. Then a few verses later in the very same passage, God himself tells us via the pen of Moses, no man can see God's face and live, for no man can see me and live. That's Exodus 33:20. When Moses emphatically states that he survived what other human beings could not, he establishes himself as having a little bit of divine edge that is above and beyond what the common person could endure. He begins to equate himself with the divine in ways that establish his leadership over Israel as not only divinely appointed, but miraculously maintained. When Moses had his personal face-to-face meetings with Jehovah, this is how they are described in the book of Exodus. Now Moses used to take a tent and pitch it outside the camp, some distance away, calling it the tent of meeting. Anyone inquiring of the Lord would go to the tent of meeting outside the camp. And whenever Moses went out to the tent, all the people rose and stood at the entrances to their tent, watching Moses until he entered the tent. As Moses went into the tent, the pillar of the cloud would come down and stay at the entrance, while the Lord spoke with Moses. Whenever the people saw the pillar of cloud standing at the entrance to the tent, they all stood and worshipped, each at the entrance to their tent. The Lord would speak to Moses face to face, as one speaks to his friend. That's Exodus 33:7-11. Now, I see this is what you're referring to, she said it. There is a motive to the writing of this. And keep in mind, this is stuff that's penned by Moses himself. So this is what he wrote about the things that happened. God descended to the tent of Moses in a cloud, just as he did when descending upon the Ark of the Covenant, in the cloudy form. His female counterpart, the Shekinah. But outside the written text, no one knows exactly what Moses encountered while alone in the tent with the presence that descended there. Whether this happened precisely as the book of Exodus describes, or whether it was a series of events that Moses used to further establish his position as the Pharaoh-God of Israel, will be a question that remains unanswered, as there's no way to establish the veracity of what he has written here. I'm going to take a side note here and say this. It's interesting when you read in the book of Exodus where Moses says, which we've already recounted a couple of times, that there I was in my tent and I spoke to God face to face as a man talks to his friend. He's establishing something about himself when he says that. I spoke to God face to face, just like I'm talking to you. But then 9 verses later in the same chapter, he writes, no man can see God's face and live. Isn't that a contradiction to what just happened with his personal experience? Isn't Moses a man? And didn't he see God face to face? But now he's saying, if any man or person sees God's face, he shall not live. Well, look at the motive behind that. What is Moses actually saying there between those 2 verses? He's saying no man can see God's face and live, but I do. You know what? I'm greater than a man. I am a brother to the gods. Keep in mind, Moses, and I'll probably hit this in the chapter, so this might be repetitive eventually here, but Moses grew up for the first 40 years of his life in Egypt, as a crown prince of Egypt, as the great high priest of Amun, as the grand vizier, Pharaoh in the place of Pharaoh. This is who this guy was. And he grew up in a religious or a spiritual system that believed that the pharaohs were gods. And that he himself, because he was Pharaoh in the place of Pharaoh, appointed to his positions by the Pharaoh, made the Pharaoh in the place of the Pharaoh, and even the name he bore, the character I believe he was Senenmut. We've covered this before. And Senenmut, even his name, meant mother's brother. I, your mother, am renaming you as brother to the gods with me. If this is indeed who Moses was, and it seems to bear out in history, then Moses would have entered the leadership of Israel with this firm belief that he is one with the gods. This is, did you know, the great sin of Moses? The reason that God did not allow him to enter the promised land, according to the biblical passages, was that he kept equating himself with God. It was for his pride, and God knocked him down a few pegs because Moses kept referring to himself in the first person with God. Let's go on. Now, I have said before, I'm not an ancient alienist. That does not mean when I wrote this book, I was not leaning in that direction. So keep that in mind as I read. There are, however, speculative ancient alienists who would chalk these events firmly to the alien encounter category. Though we cannot establish the existence of the divine beyond the faith of the human heart, some would choose to view these events as not only supernatural, but extraterrestrial. Just as the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night appeared in the skies and went before the Israelites to guide their way, the same pillar of cloud came down to the tent of Moses and later came down and settled on the Ark of the Covenant in the form of what is described in the Hebrew language by a strictly female term, the Shekinah, the grammatically feminine presence of God. According to the text of Exodus, all the people saw these events take place, and if there was any further editing of the book of Moses after Moses' death, the passages were not omitted. The event is there in the context to establish the absolute authority and sovereignty of God, as well as the absolute authority of Moses as the God-appointed leader, or in his case, letting the people know he was brother to the gods, even though he's now establishing and codifying Jewish religion. Now, also, this Shekinah glory, which I've mentioned a couple of times, remember Moses built the precursor to the temple in Jerusalem. He built the tabernacle of the covenant. It was the big tented version of of the same design as the temple. And it was there that they had the holy place and the Holy of Holies, and there they would settle the Ark of the Covenant in the Holy of Holies, and only the high priest could enter. And it said that on the day that Moses dedicated the tabernacle in the wilderness, that God's presence, his Shekinah glory, came down in the form of a cloud and settled upon the tabernacle and settled on the seat of the ark between the two cherubs. Now, the Shekinah glory, Shekinah, as I just mentioned here, is a strictly, genderically speaking, female term. So the big question has to be asked, what is this female presence of God? Is it homage to the goddess? Is it a goddess? There's questions that need to be asked. I'm not going to dig into it too deeply tonight. I may hit it a little more here. If I don't, we'll cover it another time. But this is the female presence of God descending on the Ark of the Covenant, and then also to cover the tent where Moses went to meet with God face to face. Regarding the pillars of fire and clouds themselves, it's well established in rabbinic teaching that these manifestations were nothing other than the magnificence and glory of God. Nothing other than God personally appearing in miraculous manifestations to lead his people. This is what is known to theologians as a theophany, an appearance of God in physical form. And according to Judeo-Christian teaching, this is simply the glory of God appearing at the door of Moses' tent and hovering in the sky to guide his people. Moses was set apart as the only human being to have this close contact with God, thereby establishing him as someone who was in close union with God, the next best thing to being the monarchical Pharaoh-God. Now, I want to tell you, there was a place, and this was in the prologue that I read, or the preface, introduction to the book, that the prophet Elijah asked to see God. He wanted to see God face to face. This is after the time of Moses. And it said God took him and set him in a cleft of the cliff face. And it says, and there a great whirlwind passed, a great earthquake passed, great fires passed, but none of these things had God's face. And it said that Elijah could only see his hinder parts, his butt, his back, whatever it was, as it passed, as God passed. But then it said God appeared to him in that still small voice. So even Elijah couldn't see God, but for some reason we're supposed to believe that Moses had some divine step above everybody else that God allowed him to see his face. And this is all predicated, by the way, on the absolute holiness of God. God was so holy, so far above man, that man could not look on his face and live. It would devour him. And yet Moses had the ability to do this. But Moses is the guy who told us that he had the ability to do this. And I believe he was practicing what he learned in Egypt. He is a brother to the gods. But when we see the following passage, just a few verses later, in which Moses is not allowed to see the face of God, for some reason, the same presence that spoke to Moses in the tent face to face could not allow Moses to see its face on the top of Mount Sinai. Like anyone else who experiences the mystical, the phenomenal, paranormal, there is always the desire to be drawn in and know more, see more, experience more. So Moses asked for more. In Exodus 33, 18 through 20, he said, then Moses said, now show me your glory. He wanted to see more. And the Lord said, I will cause all my goodness to pass in front of you, and I will proclaim my name, the Lord, in your presence. I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy. I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion. But, he said, you cannot see my face, for no one may see me and live. Then the Lord said, there is a place near me where you may stand on a rock. When my glory passes by, I will put you in a cleft in the rock and cover you with my hand until I've passed. Then I will remove my hand and you will see my back, but my face must not be seen. In establishing the magnificence and glory of the all-powerful Jehovah God, Moses writes that even he was not allowed to look on God's face, though just a few sentences earlier, he had established that he possessed a special hierarchical relationship with God, being the only man who had ever talked with God, quote, face to face, end quote, as a man talks to his friend. This was all written so that the people would understand that Moses, indeed as powerful as the Pharaoh gods of Egypt, he communed with the divine in the most intimate of ways. And later, during the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, as a nomadic people, Moses goes a step further. And in his anger with the people, he equates himself with God by referring to himself and God as we. For this, the scripture then tells us, Moses was reprimanded by God for his pride and not allowed to enter into the land of promise. Whether that anecdotal story was part of Moses' original account or was added later by a future editor such as Joshua, who took over the leadership of Israel after Moses' death, we don't know. But what is clear is that Moses took on himself the persona of the Pharaoh-God, the ruler who has absolute authority and absolute communion with the divine. Now, here's the residual effect of communing with deity. This is another quote from the book of Exodus, chapter 34, verses 29 through 35. When Moses came down from Mount Sinai with the 2 tablets of the covenant law in his hands, he was not aware that his face was radiant. because he had spoken with the Lord. When Aaron and all the Israelites saw Moses, his face was radiant, and they were afraid to come near him. But Moses called to them. So Aaron and all the leaders of the community came back to him, and he spoke to them. Afterward, all the Israelites came near him, and he gave them all the commands of the Lord had given him on Mount Sinai. When Moses finished speaking to them, he put a veil over his face. But whenever he entered the Lord's presence to speak with him, he removed the veil until he came out. And when he came out and told the Israelites that he'd been commanded, what he had been commanded, they saw that his face was radiant. Then Moses would put the veil back over his face until he went in to speak with the Lord. I love the way some of these old texts are written repetitively to make the point. So Moses' experience in meeting face to face with the divine left his skin shiny, in other words. According to the text, it said that he radiated this, that he had to put a veil over his face when he wasn't speaking to the people. Moses' encounters with the divine left physical traces. His face glowed, and his hair and beard turned white as snow. So frightening was his appearance that he had to veil his face to hide this radiance. His face-to-face encounters with the radioactive deity bleached his skin and made him glow. And I was being a bit facetious there when I wrote that. I don't know that it was radioactive. And according to the biblical passage, he didn't even realize it until the people recoiled in superstitious horror. It's interesting to note at this point that the watchers who descended to the slopes of Mount Hermon, and in their varying forms as manifested in other cultures around the ancient world, were said to be bright, shining gods who descended from the skies. The ancient Sumerian El, the Celtic Ailil, Babylonian Elu, the Cornish El, the Incan Ela, Hebrew Elah, and the Muslim Allah all had their varying words for the physical shining brightness of the gods who descended down to mankind. Was it this same light that was passed on to Moses during his close encounters with the Elohim? We don't know for sure. Let's move on to general and king is the next section. It's vital to establish exactly what it is Moses would have experienced during those first 40 years of his life in order to have an understanding of what influenced him when he became the leader of the wilderness wandering nation of Israel later in his life. The culture, education, and religion of Egypt would have had an intensely ingraining influence on the man, despite the Bible telling us that he made it a conscious choice to identify with his own people, which alone tells us that he was being raised as an Egyptian, living as part of the royal family of the 18th dynasty Egypt in Thebes near Luxor, roughly 400 miles up the Nile, south of present-day Cairo. Well, and up the Nile means south because the Nile flows north into the Mediterranean. Moses was less Hebrew than he was Egyptian. So for him to make a cognitive choice to identify himself with his slave people of origin was nothing less than altruistic, perhaps even heroic. You know, in one of the passages in the Jewish texts that's written about Moses, it says that he and his entourage, he arrived in a chariot with his entourage and saw his people being beaten, and he chose to identify with his people. That doesn't mean like in the movies with Charlton Heston, he stripped himself of his royal grandeur and went down into the mud pits and made bricks. It says he identified with them. And now Moses, it has been speculated, was somebody who saw an opportunity to become the leader of this slave people. And that is what drove him to do the things he did. This is why he eventually murdered the Egyptian and buried him in the sand. He saw himself as a deliverer to these people, even though it was embryonic at the time, in his mind. So, but what was his identification with the Hebrews? Was his identification with the Hebrews an act of faith as the book of Hebrews in the New Testament calls it, on his part, as the New Testament book of Hebrews tells us? Or was it an attempt to look for opportunities to rule these people? There's a traditional tale in the Jewish Mishnah that speaks of Moses leading an army under the orders of Pharaoh to quell a rebellion in Nubia. Once the rebellion is squashed, I'll bet you didn't know this about Moses unless you're familiar with the Mishnah and Jewish writings. Once the rebellion is squashed and the thousands of rebels are dead, Moses takes the throne of Nubia for his very own, much to the chagrin of the ruling family in Nubia. Word gets back to the Pharaoh, who hastily reprimands Moses, telling him to relinquish the throne to the vassal ruling family and to get his butt and his army back to Egypt. Moses, of course, abdicates the short-lived monarchy and returns to the courts of the Pharaoh. Desiring a position as the ruler of a people was in Moses' blood. He was raised as a prince, and his Egyptian queen's stepmother raised him to be the next Pharaoh. I really believe that. I cannot emphasize enough how utterly important it is in dissecting the story of the Watchers, descent to Mount Hermon, and their offspring, the Nephilim, to have an understanding of what Moses would have been exposed to in the royal tutelage and the religious philosophies of 18th dynasty Egypt. So there is the traditional story, and it goes like this. Moses was born a slave, but adopted by a queen of Egypt, where he grew up as a palace kid, enjoying an upbringing that afforded him a royal education and lifestyle. What we know from the biblical account is that as he grew older, he began to identify himself more and more with his own people and arrogantly saw himself, from his lofty position in the royal courts of Egypt, as the prophesied deliverer of the Hebrew people from their bondage. So, by the way, in all these fictional accounts and movies of Moses, and it being kept a secret from him that he was Israelite by birth, is probably not true. The Pharaoh could adopt anybody he wanted to. And if his daughter, Pharaoh's daughter, found Moses in the Nile in a basket, and she brought him into the palace, the Pharaoh, I'm pretty sure, accepted him. And it was no secret that Moses was born to Israelites. This is why his mother, I believe, renames him Senenmut. And she's no longer his mother after a while. Senenmut and Hatshepsut actually became lovers. There's more to that story. All right, and I may not have that in this book, so we may hit that or may not. So now, taking matters into his own hands, Moses murdered an Egyptian taskmaster and fled for his life from the wrath of the Pharaoh. He spent the next 40 years as a shepherd in the land of Midian, where he married the daughter of Jethro, the high priest of Midian, and lived to the age of 80 as a sort of outback, off-the-grid shepherd sheikh. It was at the age of 80 that he saw a miraculous vision of God in the form of a burning bush, and was called out to return to Egypt and lead the Hebrews out of slavery. Moses balked and attempted to get out of any task that would bring him back to the land where he had spent the first half of his life and where he was wanted for murder. But God assured him that those who sought his life were long since dead and his crimes forgotten. Moses returned to Egypt, and in a series of coercive plagues leveled against the land of Egypt, finally convinced the Pharaoh to set the Hebrews free after the plague of the firstborn took the life of Pharaoh's son. Under Moses' leadership, the Hebrews left Egypt en masse overnight in an event called the Great Exodus, which has been celebrated ever since at the Jewish Passover. And if you didn't know this, Passover was the night before the Exodus when the angel of death would pass over the Hebrews, but only if they killed a lamb and put its blood on the lintels and the doorposts of their homes. The God of blood. The Pharaoh, of course, has second thoughts, and he mounts his armies to pursue the escaping Hebrew slaves, only to have them destroyed in one of the Bible's greatest single mythically miraculous events, the parting of the Red Sea. Once completely free of Pharaoh and his armies, Moses leads the Hebrews to the holy mountain of God. Some say it is Sinai. Other writings place it at Jebel Musa in Saudi Arabia. I happen to think it was Serabit el-Khadim. John Ward and I write about this in our book. And it is here that Moses climbs to the top and meets God face to face. And God sends him back down 40 days later with the tablets of the law, inscribed by God's own hand, nonetheless, with the 10 Commandments. Upon Moses' descent, he finds the people worshiping a golden calf and partying like an Egyptian. He breaks the tablets and imposes punishment for the idolatrous worship, then returns to the mountaintop where God inscribes a new set of stone texts for him. God couldn't just make these up and give them to him and they transpire. He's got to go back up and recarve them for God. The Hebrews make their way to the land of Canaan, only to have their spies return with reports of giant Nephilim dwelling in the land. In fear, the people tell Moses that they're unwilling to enter Canaan and conquer it, even though it was promised them by God, because it was their ancestral homeland. So Moses leads them back out into the wilderness, where they wander as a nomadic tribe for 40 years. In the process of their wilderness sojourn, Moses, in an angry response to the complaints of the people, commits the sinful act of pride by equating himself with God, and is then told by God that for his punishment, he could not see the promised land. He could see it, but not enter it. As the Hebrews march into the land of Canaan, Moses ascends the slope of Mount Nebo, where he gazes into the land of God's promise and dies. His body is never found. In the entire account of the life and deeds of Moses, as written in the Old Testament, we're never given the names of the historical kings of Egypt with whom Moses lived and against whom he stood in conflict in his return to the land of to lead the Hebrews out of captivity. They are referred to only as Pharaoh or the king of Egypt or Pharaoh's daughter. Moses had particular reasons for writing these accounts the way he did, the first of which was a demonstration of just how unimportant the names of these great rulers were to the story of the deliverance of his people. Examining the life of Moses and the dating of his exploits will bring a much greater understanding of the texts he authored and subsequently his handling of the topic of the Nephilim in his book of Genesis. Now, before we go to the next section in this chapter, keep in mind, too, that in the Egyptian way of thinking, to speak the name, to write the name, was to give the name life. And so I believe that there was also this motivation in Moses to not mention the names simply because he did not wish to give them life. And he did not wish to, in an Egyptian religious sense, give them eternal life by writing them in his works. The closest he comes is by mentioning Pharaoh's daughter. There were only a handful of women in ancient Egypt who bore the title Pharaoh's daughter. And the daughter of Thutmose I, Matkare, whose regnal name was Hatshepsut, was the one that Moses, I believe, mentioned by her title, Pharaoh's daughter. Now, the making of a Pharaoh-God it is extremely important to have an understanding of the historical data surrounding these people and events. For without that information, we're left to dangle at the end of a rope of mythology and legend. Seeking out and ascribing solid dates and historical facts is nothing short of throwing wide the door of illumination on the dark room of ignorance and speculative conjecture. Of course, there are many who will say that these very facts presented here in my book are nothing but subjective hypotheses. Yet out of all the systems and theories set in place to establish the historical life of Moses, this is the one that makes the most sense by the current facts as they exist. At least when one makes an attempt to ensure the facts as presented in the Bible concur as closely as possible to the historical record. Now, there is a danger that exists out there, especially with biblical archaeologists, biblical scholars. They want to try to make history fit to the biblical story. And they're willing to alter history to do it. You can't do things that way. History is what history is. So if the historical tale does not match the written account, then something's wrong with the written account, not the historical account. And before you walk away from this chapter wondering what the historical story of Moses has to do with the sons of God and the Nephilim, consider this. The man who wrote about them in the book of Genesis experienced an upbringing, education, and lifestyle in the courts of Egyptian royalty. Being one of the progeny of the Pharaoh, who was considered to be a god, Moses was indeed himself a literal son of God in the eyes of the Egyptian people. Moses' notions of the creation of the world and the birth of humanity were greatly influenced by the religion of the Egyptian culture that was all around him during his first 40 years of life. According to the book of Exodus, Moses stepped out and chose to be identified with his own people, the Hebrew slaves. But at the same time, he did not relinquish his position in the royal family of Egypt. It is plainly evident in the passages of the biblical text that he saw his identification with the Hebrews as a way to set himself up as their promised deliverer. Now, by the way, I want to show you a picture here. Just happens to be on this page, so I probably talk about it soon. Might be hard to see. This is a bark shrine relief, and it's the highlighted area in this, at Menadot Habu in Luxor. It's the House of a Million Years, located at the upper western end of the lower portion of the north interior wall of the second courtyard, the festival hall. Northwestern quadrant. Moses would have seen this wall many times during his youth in Egypt. And now this is a photo that was given to me by Dr. John Ward. Copyright 2011. It might have been the one I saw, and we both took pictures. But if you look here, that highlighted area right in the middle looks just like the Ark of the Covenant. There's another one here up on another line. If you see that, that is an Egyptian bark shrine, which is also what was used to pattern the Ark of the Covenant. In a very real sense, there was an undercurrent of political opportunism in Moses. And I think this comes through in the text in the Bible, if you look for it. That he could not simply allow to pass this opportunity by. He may have had a faith that he was the promised deliverer, as the New Testament book of Hebrews tells us, but that faith seems to be something applied to his acts by the foundational apologists for the Christian faith, as opposed to the literal moral motivation on the part of Moses. Now, this is apologetics. When you read the life of Moses and study who he was, who he would have been, and then you read the Hebrews, the passage in the book of Hebrews in the New Testament, written by Paul, that you find it's an apologetic being put forward. Moses in great faith identified with his people. Moses stepped out by great faith and did this. And by faith, Moses did this. And Moses did that. When in fact, I don't think he did any of these things by faith. I think the only faith he had was in his arrogant ability to see himself as being deserving of and possessing the ability to govern these people. And that's what he sought to do. He was an opportunist. Let me find out where I left off. It's clear in the Exodus text that Moses saw himself as greater than those around him. A thing not at all out of place for someone raised in a family of monarchs who held an iron-fisted rule over Egypt and were also brothers and sisters to the gods. And make no mistake about it, Moses was a Hebrew in birth only during his first 40 years of life. Moses was an Egyptian through and through, as most of his writings, philosophies, adjudication of laws, and building of religious ceremonial objects implies. Even the Ark of the Covenant, which Moses, as the voice of God, gave instruction to build, resembles so closely the relief painting of Egyptian bark shrines of worship that the roots of influence are undeniable. And that's why I had that picture in there. Now, I'm going to hit something here that I do not think I mentioned here. Let me just look and see. Hold on. This is a long chapter. There's a few more pages. Now there's quite a few pages left. This could go on for a while. It's now 11 o'clock here, and you've got to be, if you watch Rocky Stucci's show, I'm on with him in 1 hour. So if you guys have the patience, I'll keep going. I've still got almost 20 pages to read in this chapter. So here we go. Didn't somebody, just looking at the last thing, didn't someone throw Moses through a glass window? The cat had horns and a speech impediment? I have no idea, to tell you the truth. Sorry about that. I don't know the answer to that one. But maybe there's more context. If somebody in the chat room knows, just go back in there. Now, let's move on. If this gets too lengthy, we'll have to cut it off, and we could certainly pick it up tomorrow night because there's still 20 pages of this chapter left. So let's move on. Solomon's Temple, the cornerstone in dating Moses. Now, I've talked about this in many interviews before, but here it is. There is a hardcore, undisputed historical date in the Old Testament on which we can hang our hat when determining the dating of the events of Moses' life. Once this date is established, the rest of the mystery surrounding Moses' life unravels. In 966 BC, in the 4th year of the reign of Solomon, the son of David, as king of Israel, even though Solomon is disputed and David's disputed, we're finding more and more history that says that they did exist. During the reign, the first Jewish temple was built in Jerusalem, known historically and archaeologically as Temple 1. And it was dedicated in 966 BC. This is an ironclad date in history, disputed only by a number of 3 to 5 years in either direction by Jewish, Christian, and historical scholars alike. 1 Kings 6:1 says, in the 480th year after the Israelites came out of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, the 2nd month, he began to build the temple of the Lord. So Solomon dedicates the temple in Jerusalem in 966 BC, 480 years after the Exodus. Sounds pretty like pretty easy math, doesn't it? And there you have it. Although even the existence of Kings David and Solomon is still in raging dispute among archaeologists, scholars, and biblical minimalists, the temple in Jerusalem was dedicated in 966 BCE, and the date is non-disputed. This brings us to the dating of the Exodus. According to the aforementioned passage from 1 Kings, the temple was dedicated in the 480th year after the Hebrews were led out of Egyptian captivity. This would make the year of the great Exodus under the leadership of Moses the first Passover of the Jewish religion, right around 1446 BCE. And if Moses was 80 years old at the time of the Exodus, he would have been born around 1526 BCE, during the reign of Thutmose I. The Egyptian pharaohs during the timeline of Moses. Thutmose I. In Exodus 1, 8 through 14, it says, then a new king came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous. And if war breaks out, they'll rejoin our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. So they put the slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Pithom and Ramses as the store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. That's out of Exodus. In accordance with the dateline we hinge on the dating of Solomon's temple, Moses was born in 1526 BCE, during the 1st year of the reign of Thutmose I, the son of Hebrew slaves Amram and Jochebed. Thutmose I ruled Egypt from 1526 to 1513 BCE. And it was during his reign, the Bible tells us, that the Pharaoh of Egypt issued a decree that all Hebrew male children below the age of 2 years be slain and cast into the Nile River. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shiphrah and Puah, when you are helping the Hebrew women during childbirth, and by the way, here's something interesting to note. Moses in his work references 2 lowly midwives by name of the Hebrews, but he couldn't even name the pharaohs. This tells you they were either omitted by choice or later by scribes for some reason. If you see that it's a baby boy, said the Pharaoh, kill them. If it's a girl, let her live. The midwives, however, feared God, and they did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. Then the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, why have you done this? Why have you let the boys live? The midwives answered Pharaoh, Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive. So God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. Then Pharaoh gave this order to all the people, every Hebrew boy that is born to you, you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. That's Exodus 1, 15 through 22. Moses' mother hid her infant son as long as she could, and when he was 3 months old, in a plot to spare him from the Pharaoh's decree, she placed him in a pitch-smeared basket woven from papyrus and set him adrift on the Nile River. Although this is not implicit in the text, it can be subjectively surmised that this was no arbitrary act of blind hope on her part. When she released him into the currents of the Nile, she ordered her daughter Miriam, Moses' older sister, to follow along in the bulrushes along the shoreline to assure that no harm came to the child and that the basket reached the destination she had hoped, the Nile backwater pools of the palace, where the Pharaoh's household came to bathe. The idea of a savior in a basket floating down a river was not exclusive, however, to the story of Moses. Sargon the Great, in the Akkadian clay cuneiform tablet, purporting to be the biography of Sargon the Great of Akkad around 2400 BCE, legend states that his mother was a temple priestess. Giving birth to him in secret and setting him in a basket to float, she abandoned him to the Euphrates River. After a gardener, Aki, a gardener, rescued him from the river and raised him. After working as a gardener for Aki, Sargon rose to the position of cupbearer to Ur-Zababa, the king of Kish, and from there went on to rise in power, sacking Uruk and establishing himself as the emperor of Sumer in place of Lugal-Zegesi, the king of Uruk. Then there's Osiris. Osiris, around 2500 BCE, the sacrificial savior god of Egypt, was murdered, after which his decapitated, crowned head was placed in a papyrus basket and floated down the Nile. Then you have Romulus and Remus. Now, this is much later, but Romulus and Remus, according to the Plutarch, were twins descended from Prince Aeneas, a fugitive from the legendary city of Troy after its destruction by the Achaeans. Their maternal grandfather was his descendant, Numitor, who inherited the kingship of Alba Longa. Numitor's brother, Amulius, inherited its treasury, including the gold bought by Aeneas from Troy. Amulius used his control of the treasury to dethrone Numitor, but feared that Numitor's daughter, Rhea Silvia, would bear children who could overthrow him. In an attempt to solidify his claim to the throne, with no other royal candidates rising to challenge him, Amulius forced Rhea Silvia to perpetual virginity as a Vestal priestess. This didn't end up working, as she bore kids anyway. According to the legend, Mars, the god of war, seduced Silvia and impregnated her. In other accounts, it was Hercules, or even Amulius himself, who impregnated his niece. Under confinement by Amulius, she gives birth to twin boys, of remarkable beauty, upon which her uncle ordered all of their deaths. Rhea was buried alive, and Amulius ordered the death of the twins by exposure. Both means would avoid his direct blood guilt. Amulius charged the servant with the deed of killing the twins, but the servant could not follow through with the act. Instead, he placed them in a basket and left it on the banks of the Tiber River, which flooded and carried the twins downstream unharmed. The river deity Tiberinus made the basket catch in the roots of a fig tree that grew in the Velabrum swamp at the base of the Palatine Hill. The twins were found and suckled by a she-wolf, Lupa, and fed by a woodpecker, Picus. A shepherd named Faustulus discovered the twin boys, took them to his hut, where he and his wife, Aequia Larientia, raised them as their own children. Romulus went on to found the city of Rome. So there's a couple of examples out of history. Now, I have a firm belief that I don't know that I actually reference it here. I'm just looking ahead, just in case. That we've had some scholars, historical scholars who are skeptics of the story, the biblical story, who said that Moses' mother, in putting Moses in a basket, was really only a legendary retelling of Osiris being cut into pieces and sent down the Nile River in a basket. And it didn't really happen. Now, I would ask the converse question. Do you think that these Hebrews, these Israelites, living in Egypt, being thoroughly Egyptianized, didn't know the stories of Osiris? Do you think that perhaps what happened was Moses' mother, in knowing the stories of Osiris, placed Moses in a basket so the princess would take note of the basket in the Nile and the baby and think there was something to it? I think she took the opportunity to appeal to the religious sensibilities of the Egyptians by placing Moses in the basket, because it's exactly what happened to Osiris. That's the way I see it. Hatshepsut. Now we're going to move on to this woman. And Hatshepsut, this remarkable woman, was the daughter of Thutmose I. Born in or around 1535 BC, she went on to marry her half-brother Thutmose II, fathered by Thutmose I, and to a lesser wife. He was pretty weak and somewhat sickly in his reign, and she loathed the man. When he died, she became co-regent of Egypt with her stepson, Thutmose III, from yet again a lesser wife. And eventually she deposed him. I don't think, by the way, that she deposed him. That's what I wrote when I wrote this book. She didn't depose him. She became co-regent with him and eventually sent him north. She took on the role of Pharaoh, and she made him the general of all her armies as he grew older. And it was a very peaceful reign. So she didn't depose him. She took over the monarchy, however, as the ruler herself. Thutmose III, it says, there were some streams of thought, and I wrote here, learned to hate his stepmother. I don't think that was the case. I've changed my view on this due to my research, but let's just read the book. And when she died, he had all Hatshepsut's imagery stricken from every painting, obelisk, and relief, eradicating her from Egyptian history and the afterlife. Thutmose III went on to bring Egyptians' united kingdom during the 18th dynasty to its golden pinnacle. Now, I will say this about Thutmose III. It has been found since I wrote this book, the train of thought really is that he did not despise his aunt, stepmother. He did what every pharaoh did, and that was he went through erasure. He erased some of her images and claimed her temples as his own, establishing the fact that I am now pharaoh in my own right. But he left off eradicating her images. That was finished. That job was finished 40 years later by his son, Amenhotep II. And we'll get into that, and I'll tell you more about that in a bit. So I don't think Thutmose III eradicated her image out of hatred. I think it was just to establish I'm Pharaoh now. I'm dude. So in 1526, Hatshepsut would have been a mere child of about 7 to 10 years old when she found the baby Moses in a basket floating into her bathing pool off the Nile. She claimed him and named him. Hold on, gotta turn the page. But had no way to care for him as her own. It was then that Miriam, Moses' sister, emerged from the bulrushes, offered to help, taking the child back to his mother to have him weaned and cared for until the royal princess was old enough to legitimately adopt him, which she did a few years later. And then, of course, the story skips 40 years and takes us into Moses as an adult. It can be speculated that a man named Senenmut, very close to Hatshepsut, and the tutor to her daughter, was none other than Moses himself. Though the evidence is only circumstantial, one must read a bit between the lines and hail to Egyptian mythology to make the connections. Senenmut was very close to Hatshepsut and was her strongest ally, advisor, and friend. A lowly-born man who rose to power with Hatshepsut. It's speculated that his lowly birth was as a Hebrew slave, and his close stepson relationship to Hatshepsut was nothing short of the love between mother and son, and the nepotism that came along with it. The name Senenmut itself means mother's brother. To understand the significance of his mother's brother title, it is necessary to look briefly at Egyptian religion and the pharaoh. The ancient Egyptians believed that the first king of Egypt was Osiris, married to his sister Isis. Set, the brother of Osiris, murdered him out of jealousy and claimed the throne. Incorporating a spell of magic, Isis brought Osiris back to life for one night, made love with him, and conceived a child, after which Osiris returned to his death state. The child she bore was Horus, the reincarnation of Osiris, who reclaims his rightful place on the throne. The child born to Isis was all at once her son, her husband, and her brother. All kings of Egypt were then said to be Horus, the reincarnation of Osiris. And this is the significance of the name given to Moses, Senenmut. He was being set up by his mother, Hatshepsut, in the Egyptian economy to very possibly be the future king, the royal heir of his grandfather, Pharaoh, Tutmosis I, who had no living royal male heirs, but he had one royal daughter, Hatshepsut. The future king could only inherit the throne through the royal daughter. Hatshepsut convinced her father, the pharaoh, to make her little adopted boy his future heir. Neferuri, as the symbolic Isis, had her little Osiris Horus, who was named Senenmut, his mother's brother. When Senenmut Moses makes the decision to identify himself with his slave people, the Hebrews, he forever cut himself off from the adopted pharaonic line of Hatshepsut. Now, by the way, I wrote that when I wrote this book back in 2011. I've completely changed my view on that. Not because I think differently, but because I've learned differently. I do not believe for an instant that she was necessarily setting him up to be king. What she did do was bestow on him royal titles, possibly setting him up to be king. And we do know that he was the Grand Vizier. We know he was all these titles. She gave him 92 royal titles. And then he disappears when he tries to make himself the deliverer to the Hebrews. And in Hebrews 11:24, by faith Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Interesting. Some of Senenmut's works, or Senenmut Moses, many titles conferred on him by Hatshepsut are the following: overseer of the works, overseer of the fields, overseer of the double gold house, overseer of the gardens of Amun, controller of works, overseer of the administrative office of the mansion, conductor of festivals, overseer of the cattle of Amun, steward of the king's daughter Neferura, chief of the king, magnate of the tens of the upper and lower of Upper and Lower Egypt, chief of the mansion of the Red Crown, privy counselor, chief steward of Amun, overseer of the double granary of Amun, chief architect, grand vizier, and none other than the hereditary crown prince of Egypt. One day, then there was the murder and the flight. Exodus 3:11 through 15. This is according to the biblical tale. One day after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Looking this way and that way, and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. The next day he went out and saw two Hebrews fighting. He asked the one in the wrong, "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" And the man said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, "What I did must have become known." When Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian. Now, shortly before Hatshepsut's death, in 1483 BCE, Senenmut mysteriously and completely disappears from the royal court. So, by the way, I have the date wrong in here. I just noticed that, 1483. No, that's about right. It's 1483. Never mind me. Senenmut mysteriously and completely disappears from the royal courts of Egypt and the historical records. Having been groomed to be the next pharaoh, it becomes clear that Senenmut, Moses' adopted half-brother, Thutmose III, the co-regent with his stepmother Hatshepsut, had every motivation to eliminate Moses after he murdered the Egyptian taskmaster. So Moses, formerly Senenmut, hereditary prince and count of Egypt, fled to the wilderness for his life. He would not return to Egypt for 40 years, but when he did, it was with a much different influence on the royal courts of Egypt. But Moses, at this point in his life, despite identifying himself with his Hebrew people, was thoroughly Egyptian, and he carried with him to the land of Midian a wealth of stored Egyptian knowledge that simmered in his head for more than 40 years. The king in the making, mother's brother to the Pharaoh queen, general in the armies of Pharaoh, with a deep-set ambition to rule, was now married to the daughter of a high priest in Midian, and monarch to herds of sheep and goats in a dusty Arabian backwater. Moses possessed a belief in the gods of Egypt, and this wouldn't change until his miraculous encounter with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the great I Am, Yahweh, who in the form of a burning bush. Was that encounter one of a spiritual nature, or one that would come to fit the mold of an extraterrestrial encounter that challenged all his beliefs in the pantheon of gods with which he raised and with whom he knew so well? By the way, remember I said extraterrestrial? Doesn't necessarily mean aliens. It means not of this earth, celestial. The pages of Scripture tell us that this calling was of divine origin, and that Jehovah God himself was the power behind the upcoming miraculous events. The big question, if you step outside the box of faith, is whether or not Moses was encountering the God of the universe, or a being that only fit his perceptions and understanding of that which had been rooted in his mind since his earliest days. Now, we're going to get into a little something else here. I hope you're all still with me. I hope you're all still enjoying this. Let's move on. We're going to talk about the ogdoad. You know who the ogdoad are? Have you ever heard of them? The ogdoad. In Thebes, the little town of Medidat Habu, was nestled on its low crest the ruins of the magnificent 18th dynasty mortuary temple of Ramses III. Medidat Habu, a small village situated a little more than 2 miles to the south of the Ramesseum, was called Janat by the ancient Egyptians, and according to popular belief, was the place where Amun appeared for the first time. From ancient times, Medidat Habu was the place of worship dedicated to this god, as evidenced by the crumbled ruins of a temple of the 18th dynasty dedicated to Amun of Janat, built during the time of Hatshepsut and Thutmose III, atop the ruins of a still more ancient temple. This was what later induced Ramses III to order the construction there of his own memorial temple. Growing up in the royal palace in Thebes, Moses would have known this place well and worshipped in its sacred halls. It was here that Moses was raised in his early years and spent the first 40 years of his life. He would have been taught not only the mathematics and sciences afforded a royal education in the courts of 18th dynasty Egypt, but also would have experienced the worship and religious practices of the day. By the way, when I was at Menedot Habu, crossing over the threshold into the Holy of Holies, there's an old threshold that's there of stone, and it's concave a bit from the thousands of years of people stepping on this threshold. I remember looking at John Ward and said, Moses' feet touched this stone, no matter what, no matter who he was, where he was raised here, he was in the palace, and he touched here. And by the way, it was at that same moment, anecdotally, where a little old guy in a pith helmet was coming out as we were going in. He was like, excuse me, and he moves out. And John Ward looks at me and goes, brother, do you know who that was? That's John Anthony West. And I said, really? And I looked, and sure enough, it was John Anthony West. And so we went out and introduced ourselves, and that's how I got him to come and speak at the Paradigm Symposium the next year. And he came on our radio shows. But that's where I met John Anthony West, coming out of the Holy of Holies at Menedot Habu in Luxor. Let's see. All right. Somebody's saying something about typos. All right, here we go. The ogdoad is the Egyptian creation myth that Moses would have been familiar with, and that some say laid his basis for writing about creation in the book of Genesis. The ogdoad myth originated in Hermopolis and consisted of 8 personified primeval forces, each of which was represented in the 4 couples of deities. In Egyptian cosmology, the number 4 represented the number of totality and completeness. The significance of these 4 primeval couples is not easy to understand today, for they lack any greater mythological context, and neither is there much substantive personification of the 4 couples of deities. The couples of the ogdoad were Nu and Nonet, representing the primeval waters, Heh and Hauhet, signifying boundlessness. Then there was Kek and Kauket, signifying darkness, and Amun and Amonet, signifying air. The 4 couples of the ogdoad are less about their personalities and characteristics than they represent the elemental forces of the creation of the world. The cosmogony they represent are the primeval physical matters of existence rather than the actual springing to life of the organic world and of those 8 deities. Only Amun developed into a remarkable status and moved to Thebes with his female counterpart, Amunet. These 4 pairs of deities also complemented each other, for every male deity is the female counterpart, to make up the whole. According to the ancient Egyptian complementary way of thinking, the males are shown with the heads of frogs and the females with the heads of snakes. Such physical attributes are frequently said in ancient texts to inhabit the primeval waters. At El Ashmunin were unearthed only very scant inscriptions of the ogdoad, telling us very little about this cosmogony, but they appear ever so subtly in the writings of Moses. The main part of evidence is taken from the Theban monuments, which were pieced together in 1929 by Kurt Seth in his survey Amun and Die Acht. I thought I was bad at Egyptian names. Die Acht Argatter van Hermopolis. That's German. But the earliest references to the Hermopolitan cosmogony is found in the pyramid texts, stating, "You have your offering bread, O Neo and Nenet, you 2 protectors of the gods, who protect the gods with your shadow, who have your offering bread, O Amun and Amunet, you 2 protectors of the gods, who protect the gods with your shadow. You have your offering bread, O Atum and Ruti, who yourselves created your godheads and your persons. O Shu, and Tephanet, who made the gods, who begat the gods, and established the gods. These deities were said to comprise the very substances out of which creation was brought to the universe. At Hermopolis, the opinion was that at some point these 8 primeval beings interacted, whereupon a great expansion occurred, which somehow laid free the primeval mound. The mound later became Hermopolis, though at first it was called the Isle of Flame, as the sun god was said to be born and to rise there for the very first time. Hermopolis claimed to predate the cosmogony of Heliopolis, just as other creation centers maintain that their location was the original place where creation first had come into being. So it was also the case at Hermopolis. The ogdoad were the fathers and the mothers who came into being at the start, who gave birth to the sun, who created Atom. From there on, the rest of the cosmos is developed, but there are some twists to the story in which the 8 divinities of the ogdoad are thought jointly to have created what is known as the cosmic egg out of the primeval waters, Nun. This egg was invisible as it was created already before the sun came into being. From this egg, according to some sources, the bird of light, an aspect of the sun god, burst. Other sources say that the egg was filled with air, the association of the elemental couple of Amun and Amunet. According to the coffin texts, this is the first act of creation. O Atom, give me this sweet air which your nostrils, for which I am this egg, for which is in the greater cackler. I am the garden of this great prop, which separates the earth from the sky. If I live, it will live. If I grow old, it will grow old. If I breathe the air, it will breathe the air. I am he who splits iron. I have gone round about the egg, even I, the Lord of tomorrow. In another version of this myth, the egg is laid by a goose, the primeval goose, or the Gengenwar, with which Amun was associated as the creator. The goose is thought to carry the egg out of which creation comes. This myth is only given in fragments, but obviously it states that the sun, in the form of the bird, came out of the egg that the primeval goose laid in the waters of creation. It is also a form of Amun in his creator-god aspect. The act of creation is performed by the ogdoad takes this basic chronological order. 1. The ogdoad created existence in the form of the primeval mound or in the form of the cosmic egg. 2. The cosmic egg was created by the primeval goose. 3. The cosmic egg held air, or 4. The cosmic egg held the bird. 5. And the bird was from the sun. To sum it all up, if that didn't lose you along the way, we're talking ancient religion here. To sum it all up, all forms of initial creation happened in the darkness of the primeval waters. Creation, and remember Genesis 1:1? In the beginning, God created the heavens, the earth, and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters and said, let there be light. So, birth led to decline, death, rebirth, renewal of the cycle existence. The significance of all this is that some things existed before existence. One of these in pre-existence was Nun. Another was the primeval beings such as frogs and snakes. Frogs being associated with fertility, snakes being associated with the circulatory and rebirth. That is, they shed their old skin. The first creator God is created out of Nun by some interaction between all these primeval creatures. When the creator God creates the rest of the cosmos. These are the things Moses, wrapping it all up, these are the things he would have experienced in his religious training, growing up in the royal courts of Egypt. But how are they applicable to our study of the Nephilim? And why are these backdrops important to their study? Because the setting of a solid foundation is critical to an examination of the words he wrote in the book of Genesis. As I stated earlier, it's important to sludge through some of what seems to be mundane history in order to understand why certain things were said in certain ways. Understanding what motivated Moses to write the things he did is an all-important step to understanding the objectives of the things he wrote about. Let's look at how the Egyptian myth of creation was a foundation for what Moses wrote in the book of Genesis. Moses and the heretic. Now, there's just a few pages left, so we're getting there. And we'll have you off in time boy, I sound like a school teacher. We'll have you off in time for the next class, which is the Rocky Stucci Situation Room with me, Scotty Roberts. Moses the heretic. A great source for this examination of the influences of the writing of Moses are the writings of Irenaeus, a 2nd century bishop of Lugdunum in Gaul, then a part of the Roman Empire, now Lyons, France. He was an early church father and apologist, and his writings were formative in the early development of Christian theology, which at the time was indistinguishable from Catholic theology. Irenaeus' best-known book, Adversus Heresis, or Against Heresies, was written around 180 of the Common Era, and its detailed attack on Gnosticism, which was at the time considered to be a serious threat to the church. As one of the first great Christian theologians, Irenaeus emphasized the traditional elements in the church, especially the episcopate, scripture, tradition, and tradition. Irenaeus wrote that the only way for Christians to retain unity was to humbly accept a single doctrinal authority, and that was the episcopal councils in unison with the Bishop of Rome. Against the Gnostics, who said that they possessed a secret oral tradition from Jesus himself, Irenaeus maintained that the bishops in different cities are known as far back as the apostles. None of them were Gnostics. He also maintained that the bishops provided the only safe guide to the interpretation of Scripture. His writings, with those of Clement and Ignatius, are taken to hint at papal primacy, the infallible word of the Pope in all matters ecclesiastical and scriptural. Irenaeus is the earliest witness to recognition of the canonical character of all 4 Gospels, and is really the precursor to the Constantinian councils that established canonical rules for the Bible. The Gnostics claimed to possess the hidden mysteries as relayed to them by Jesus Christ himself. And according to their heretical teachings, Moses constructed the entirety of the Genesis account of creation on his early influence in Egyptian teachings of the ogdoad. Irenaeus sets about in his writings to present and dissemble the writings of the Gnostics regarding Moses and creation, first referring to them as the development of mighty fictions. According to Irenaeus, Moses followed the pattern of the ogdoad in the fashion in which he wrote the account of creation. This can get a little sticky, believe it or not, so stick with me here. At the beginning of Moses' account of creation in the book of Genesis, he starts out in verse 1 of Genesis 1 by saying that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and by creating a numerical number of 4 elements to the first statement of creation. God created heavens and earth. Moses was establishing the first tetrad, or grouping of 4, of the Gnostics, and hailing back to the initial 4 elements of the 4 God couples of the Egyptian ogdoad. See where this is going now? It's fascinating stuff. You got to just be sitting on the edge of your seat. Here, we'll read on. Moses went on in his creation account by stating that the creative act was invisible and hidden in nature, a reference to the invisible egg of creation, a visible physical creation birthing from an invisible spiritual dimension. Now the earth was invisible and unformed, Genesis 1:2 says. Then by naming an abyss and darkness, in which were also water and the Spirit moving upon the water, Moses is referring to the second tetrad that births out the first, invisible, unformed, Spirit moved. Then, proceeding to mention the Gnostic decad, or decad, Moses names light, day, night, the firmament, the evening, the morning, dry land, sea, plants, and in the 10th place, trees all as part of the initial creative act. Thus, by means of these 10 names, he indicated the 10 aeons of the Gnostic structure, again based on the Egyptian ogdoad. Moses then reiterates the power of the Gnostic duodecad, and names the sun, the moon, the stars, the seasons, the years, whales, fishes, reptilians, birds, quadrupeds, wild beasts, and after all of these in the 12th place, man, who was also being formed after the image. In this, the Gnostics taught that the triacontad 30, existed in a tripartite division of an ogdoad. 8. The decad, 10. The duodecad, 12, was spoken of through Moses by the Spirit. Further, man was also being formed after the image of the power above, had in himself that ability that flows from one source, the invisible force.
The force! Oh, you seek Yoda.
Well, Moses also hails, moving on. This ability was seated in the region of the brain, from which 4 faculties proceed, after the image of the tetrad above. And these are called sight, hearing, smell, taste. Moses also hails to the ogdoad in stating that man has 4 sets of 2 eyes, 2 nostrils, 2 ears, 2 senses of taste, bitter and sweet. Now, Moses continues on with his, and by the way, I'm on the final 2 pages of this chapter, right there, those 2. Here we go. It's 1137. Moses continues on with his ogdoad construct in that the sun was created on day 4. The tented courts of the tabernacle were made of fine linen, blue, purple, and scarlet. Again, the long robe of the priest falling over his feet was adorned with 4 rows of precious stones. Moses also shows the influence of the ogdoad again in that man was formed on the 8th day. His earthly part was formed on the 6th day, but his fleshly part on the 8th, multiples of 4. And then Moses states that the ark of Noah was 30 cubits high, again, the tricontad, and that 8 persons were saved inside, most clearly indicates that the ogdoad, which brings salvation. Now, for the record, I know very little about Gnosticism personally and how it works. However, it appears that they at least believed that Moses was writing in multiples that revealed a heavy influence of the teaching of the Egyptian ogdoad creation. Now, the last section of this chapter, why the hell is Moses important to the Nephilim? Why do we need to have an understanding of all this stuff I just read? The place we draw our primary source for the Hebrew word Nephilim is in the book authored by Moses, an historical character drenched in the waters of Judeo-Christian biblical tradition. In many circles of non-religious thought, this sinks Moses deep into the pond of religious mythology, where even his existence as a real person falls under the voluminous waves of skeptical attack. So, having even a brief understanding of his history and a light touch on the probable history surrounding his existence and interaction with the people living in the known historical courts of Egypt lends some credence to the things he is said to have traditionally written. When there is scholarly controversy, even over the lives and deeds of royal Egyptian figures who are established in the historical record, how can we even begin to establish the credible existence of someone who, by mention of his name alone, casts him in the shadowy light of religious mythology? Moses' presence in the established Egyptian history is, for all practical purposes, anonymous. So it is ultimately important in research works that are traditionally held be authored by him to establish who he was, when he lived, what he experienced, and from where he drew his foundational abilities and philosophies, in order to lend some modicum of concrete foundation for the things about that which he wrote. And I believe I've accomplished that goal in the preceding words. Defy the auto-psychological response to discount anything that God goads you to offhandedly dismiss something simply because it's entrenched in religious or mysterious belief systems. And open your eyes to the reality that even religious writers with hugely miraculous events ascribed to them have their place in real history. Moses wrote the books of the law of the Hebrews. There is no question in my mind. He penned the passage in the book of Genesis regarding the Nephilim, though, I believe, as an abridged retelling of already widely accepted events sourced in already ancient texts of his day in the 15th century BCE. His later mention of the Nephilim, the descendants of Anak, who the spies said were living in the land of Canaan, may have been a later edit by Moses or his successor Joshua, but the passage still reveals hints and clues as to the existence of these beings. Moses relied heavily on the original accounts of Enoch, as rewritten after the Babylonian captivity in the 3rd century BCE, and on his early religious education as a son of the Pharaoh in the 18th dynasty Egypt. A final thought on Moses. As a result of my 30 years of study, research, and contemplation on this remarkable man, is that he was establishing himself as none other than the Pharaoh-God of the Israelites. Everything he learned in the royal courts, he incorporated into establishing his leadership. His talks with God gave him the seal of divine kinship and approval before the people, something that most leaders of coups or rebellions strive very hard to accomplish. His word was law, and his kingly arrogance could only have found its roots in the leadership styles and qualities he learned from the best, the Tutmosis Hatshepsut family of Egyptian monarchs. Of all this, he gave us the Nephilim, though borrowed from other faith writings of his day, blended with the gods of Egypt. And thus endeth the reading for this evening. Tomorrow we're going to hit chapter 4 of the pan-cultural effect. So that is, my friends, precisely the end of the chapter for tonight. Now, long chapter. I didn't realize it was as long because I didn't look at it before I read it tonight, and I couldn't remember this by off the top of my head. But let's look back here at some of the things you've had to say. And Kitten Woot, you are welcome. You're welcome, Judith. You're welcome, Casper. Let me go back through here and see if there's anything we need to address. Lots of stuff in here. Written with motive. I meant Moses. Late but ready to listen. I remember reading those early on. Chris had to go. Work time. Sorry you couldn't be with us, Chris. I'm sure you'll listen later. Let's see. I had to finish a grapefruit. Sticky hands, says Deb. All right. Adding to the playlist. Greetings, Scotty, says Mark, everyone. He only saw his butt. I knew somebody was going to pick up on that. Thank you, Brian. Yes, his backside. So as we go on here, got to watch this again from the beginning. Yeah, it's pretty heavy stuff. See, writing about the Nephilim, a lot of people thought, surely I just took this book and wrote this lighthearted ancient alien type of thesis. Not even thesis. A bit of light fare. It's really not. There's a whole lot to it before you even get into the actual Nephilim themselves. Moses was mooned by God. Yeah, it's a good way to look at it. He wasn't allowed to enter the promised land because of the rock and water thing. No, it's because at the rock and water thing, he struck the rock and he said, do we always have to do this for you? Equating himself with God. So the great sin was the equating himself to God because God is a jealous God and so on. So his great sin in not being able to enter the land was because he was arrogant and made himself equal to God, according to the scripture. Let's see. Moses had the shining, yes. The angels were described as having shining countenances. The Elohim were. Art of drama into my reading. I don't know what I did that was dramatic, but I'll take that. Let's see. Yo, Captain Roberts. Yo ho. Yo ho there, brother. Yin yang yourself. Let's see. And some of these are way back in the chat tonight. Coin a new term, two now and then. Hello, yin yang, somebody said. Stepmother, loving, oh my. Let's see. Hey, dude, greetings from Osaka. Says Macabre Menace. How you doing, by the way? Let's see. Mana with shrooms. There you go. Who knows? It said it was light and fluffy and fell down. Who knows what it was, really? Maybe it was just miraculous. That's a possibility. What about Moses making them drink the crushed tablets? Yeah, remember he ground those all up, and then he ground up the golden calf into a fine dust and put it in the water and made everybody drink it. There you go. That'll teach you. I always felt sorry for Moses. All that work for nothing. Not seeing the promised land. Yeah, there is that. But you know when he did set foot in, according to some theologians, remember the transfiguration where Jesus met with the glowing spirits of Moses and Elijah, and the disciples watched this. Somebody once said Moses did make it to the promised land. So there you go. All right, microdots. Let's see. I'm just looking for more comments. 40 years to travel to 200 miles or so. No, it was 40 years of wandering in circles is what they did. They basically became a nomadic tribe, and they wandered from waterhole to waterhole and back and forth. I'm sure season to season. And I don't know why. Maybe some people did break off and just go into the promised land. You know, there is one theory that the tribe of Dan said, enough of this. And they broke off from Moses and the rest of the Israelites. And they went north in Israel, through what is Israel or Canaan, up into Lebanon. And they settled with the remnant of the Anu, the people of the Anu. And that they mated with them and eventually mated. Makes it sound like animals in the wild. They converged their tribes. They ended up intermarrying, had children. And that this was the group that moved west across Mesopotamia, across Greece, into Europe, Eastern Europe, and into Europe. That these were the same people that are connected to the remnant of the Anunnaki. So it's a very interesting story, the tribe of Dan. I don't think the tribe of Dan was putting up very well with the wandering in the wilderness. So history is written by the victors. Don't remember who said that. I believe it's true. And yeah, it's absolutely true. Where are we and why are we here? Let's see. Napoleon wrote it. The Ark of the Covenant is a nuclear reactor ripped off from the Egyptians, and it made shrooms. Well, there's a theory. I think it was just a box covered in gold, and it held the objects. I think we attribute some kind of power to it because it was said to have killed people who touched it and so on. That was supposed to be the power of God that killed people that touched it. There are some that say it exists today. There are Zionists who say they have the original Ark of the Covenant. Is it killing people? I don't know. I think that may have just been something attributed to miraculous power of God. I don't think you take shittim wood, which is basic scrub wood, and slap it together, overlay it with gold, and suddenly you have a powerhouse. I don't think it works that way. There's lots of golden boxes that don't kill people. So I think that the spiritual aspect was supposed to be the miraculous aspect. Thank you, Judith. This is great, she says. The wannabe Apostle Paul, right? I remember I mentioned him at one point. Didn't someone throw Moses through a... Oh, I saw this one earlier. The cat had horns and a speech impediment. I have no idea. Unless by cat you mean the cat had horns and a speech impediment. Did you know that the horns that appear in some of the statues, like Michelangelo's statue of Moses, see the little nubby horns coming out? Those horns were put there because of the anti-Jewish sentiment. It was an anti-Semitism. And for Michelangelo to have carved, no matter how he felt about Moses, he had to put the horns there in order to appease the anti-Semitism of the day. Let's see. And as Pharaoh adopted, Moses would have been trained in the higher mystery schools. Indeed, he was. We can only guess at what those were like. We have some idea, but it would have been an amazing education. What a swine of a thing to do. See, good stuff, lots of smart people. I'm not sure what you're referring to there. Really enjoyed this tonight, but going to have to catch the replay. That's all right. Solomon is fiction. Some say soul of man. Others say Sol, sun, and on moon, sun and moon. Yes, those are some constructs of his name. I think it's very interesting that Solomon is said to have possessed the ring of power, which gave him power. I think Lord of the Rings almost. He had the ring of power, which gave him power over the demons, and that he called on demonic hordes to help build the Temple of Solomon. Interesting study all by itself. Sounds like Moloch worship. I'm not sure what we're referring to there. Just place the baby on the platform. That's right. That's what they did in the days of Nimrod. Can't remember, but a pagan god has the same story. Not sure which story you're talking about, but yeah, there were a lot of stories shared. Had their versions of. I've been asking rods for confirmation while you read, Scotty, says Brian. Oh, that's interesting. What'd you get? Let's see. Good observation, Scotty. What do the rods say? Casper, the rods agree, but it's kind of a metaphor. Okay. 10-4. Claimed and named, not name it and claim it. Cool to hear some good mythology in the story, too. Yes. All mythology. The bourbon catching up with Casper. I have those moments where my bourbon or my scotch, single malt Highland scotch, catches up to me. Not as often as I'd like it to be. As soon as you said Yahweh, my screen froze. How about that? Judith still loving it. Thank you, Judith. Is Yahweh the God of the universe? Some say he is. Let's see. This is where the whole typo talk came in. Typos, blah, blah, blah. The guy you cried when he died, Namast. Not sure what that was. Unless you're referring to my story at Senenmut's tomb. Subscribe. Yes, please subscribe. That'd be great. Rocks, like and subscribe. Share and like. Yes, thank you, everybody, for saying that. I appreciate that. Fabergé egg, jeweled Easter eggs made for the Tsar of Russia. It's not the ogdoad. Let's see. Thanks. Enjoyed it. Amphibian and reptilian. Be there to watch me and Rocky. Rocky and I are on in 6 minutes, folks. So I'm going to wrap this up. It looks like I'm right at the end of everything. I think Moses was supposed to be older than 33, but look up the 33 parallel and the occult, Charlie. Casper, Moses was supposed to have been 40 at the time he left Egypt, 80 when he returned, and 120 when he died. The three 40s. All right, folks, I want to thank you for listening tonight. It was a long chapter, a little tedious to get through some of it. I hope you still enjoyed it, and I hope that you got some good information out of it. Rocky Stucci's Situation Room is up in about 5 minutes, and I'll be joining Rocky tonight. Don't even know what we're talking about yet. So, but we'll know when we get there. I'm going to go do a quick costume change and be ready for Rocky's show. Thanks for being here. Tomorrow night, we're going to do chapter 4. Then after that, I might be a night or two off because I fly back home from North Carolina on Thursday, and Friday will be my first day back home in a while. And so we'll see where it goes from there. A couple of days break after tomorrow night. So there you have it, folks. Thanks for being here, and I'll see you again. And join us for Rocky's show right after this. Bye for now.